Okay, where is it? Is Tomas here? Where's my presentation? I can go. Apparently he's. Is this me here? No, that's PDF.
Sullins.
That's PDF.
Sullins.
Yeah, that's not the PowerPoint. That's a PDF. I'll go get mine. Yes. Yes. Okay. Wonderful. We are in business, ladies and gentlemen. It's very, very pleased, and it's a great honor for me to be with you today. When I heard that Mike Davidson, my friend and colleague, couldn't come, I emailed Tomas and said, well, since he's talking about issues that I know about, maybe I could, give a fill-in presentation, thinking remotely. And Tomas came back and said, well, actually, we'd love for you to come and talk about same-sex marriage. So I have some friends who say they'll support my travel if they approve, then it's worthwhile. So I said, well, they'll never approve this. It's a $2,000 plane ticket. But they emailed me back and said, yeah, great, go. So I was stuck. I got on a plane, and I'm here, and I'm very happy to be here with you today. The title of this presentation is Same-Sex Parenting and the Well-Being of Children, and I'm going to talk about that in the context of some other issues that I've heard you talk about today. And I want to give a shout out to our translators who've been doing a great job. If I didn't have my headphones on 5 minutes ago, I wouldn't have known that I was going to be the next speaker, so I appreciate that very much. So Greta, I'm going to skip what you have as the first slide, and we're going to go right to the second slide. So I think it's important in a conference like this to talk about what a family is, because sometimes we can forget these basic things. The Merriam-Webster dictionary says it's the basic unit in society, traditionally consisting of two parents rearing their children. That's a pretty good definition. And that's the only definition you would have found maybe 30 years ago. They add now another definition that there are other kinds of families. But think about that, the basic unit in society. We could say that even better because, and I hope you don't mind if I speak from my Catholic faith, because that's how I think about these things, that the family is the first primordial institution in society. We call it the pre-political institution. And it's not that maybe we should think of the family as being in society, but as the society being in the family in certain important respects. But that's what it is. Now, if you look at any culture in the world, speaking, let's say, as a cultural anthropologist, almost every culture has an institution, a set of relationships that we would recognize as a family, and almost all of those institutions have three characters that we also would recognize as being part of the traditional family as we understand it. One, sexual exclusivity. When a man and a woman get married or form a family in any culture, there's an understanding that he's going to be faithful to her and her alone, and she's going to be faithful to him and him alone. Now, there are some flexibility or different understandings of that at certain times, but it's never the case that anybody can have sex with anybody they want. And that includes even polygamous kind of families. Then there's stability, usually lifelong permanence in a family. And families always have a public status. Now, these three features of the family are important. they're important for children. And so my point here in saying this is that the organization of the institution of the family in society is not in consideration of the individuals involved. It's in consideration of the children that those individuals are likely to be producing. So parental sexual exclusivity increases the children's chances of survival. People often don't think of this, but the reason families are sexually faithful is to prevent the transmission of disease. It is so that those people will survive. If you're in an age before antibiotics and people are not sexually faithful in families, a large portion of your population is going to be wiped out by sexually transmitted diseases. And so when we move away from sexual exclusivity, it may be a moral fault and a moral failing and a tragedy, and we may have our feelings hurt in many ways, but what really is dangerous is that it opens people up to diseases that they wouldn't have otherwise. Now, just to jump ahead a bit, in same-sex relationships, there is no expectation of sexual exclusivity. And particularly male same-sex relationships are almost never sexually exclusive. If we had time, I could show you study after study done by pro-LGBT scholars. They're not being critical, but they have a hard time even finding one couple that has sexual exclusivity. In some studies, one of the partners thinks they're sexually exclusive, but the other partner whom they interview separately says, no, we're not really. About 60% of gay male couples in the Scandinavian countries have written explicit agreements for the conditions under which they will have and they will tolerate sex outside of the relationship. So there is no sexual exclusivity in those gay male relationships, which are called marriages in most contexts. And so guess where we have the highest rate of new HIV, STD transmission in the industrialized world? Men who have sex with men. They're called in the literature MSM. Gay males having sex with other gay males, even when they're married, at a very high rate of partnerships, and so they have the return of these diseases that for persons who follow sexual exclusivity, they are free from them. Now, that's a long way to say that's a very basic benefit of the traditional family. Lifelong permanence assures to children the care of both of their parents through their full development. A very, very important thing. We just heard our friend from Austria underline this as important for families and for children. And then public identification ensures a connection to the child's father. We find that a connection to a father is more important for children's health than connection to a mother as they enter into maturity. Not to denigrate the connection with the mother, that's also very important, but if you had to choose between the two, a connection with the father is important, and the only way you can ensure a father's connection to their children is to make that a public connection. Why is that? Because a mother always knows whether or not that child is hers. A father doesn't know unless it's made public, and unless she says, this is your child, and makes that, and says to everyone else, this is his child. And so a father might have to wonder unless it's made open and a public declaration. So all of these are ways to secure the transfer of family resources from parents to children. Property, yes, but also love, identity, tradition, a place in the world. All of these come by way of the family. In the modern world, we have moved away from the natural family and the natural benefits of the family. And I have this like a stair step. We're stepping down from the natural design of the family, the natural design being what I've just described, two permanent biological parents caring for their own children. The closest thing we call that in the research world is intact married biological parents, which is right up here at the top. Let me see if I can get my, yeah, I love this thing. So we start there, but then in the modern world we move away. We have unmarried biological parents. They're close, but not quite the natural design. Why not? Because they're typically not as securely permanent for the children. Then we have married step parents. That's following divorce. So the great gateway problem for family decline in our age is the rise of divorce. And so after divorce, we have these step parents. It turns out that when a couple dissolves their relationship, the children undergo some trauma and have therefore higher rates of psychological difficulty if they've experienced divorce. Now, typically in the United States, the children will go with the mother. There's a presumption that the mother's better than the father to care for the child. That varies from country to country, but it's pretty much the norm in most industrialized countries. Now, if that mother gets married again, she thinks, I'm going to kind of restore normalcy to this child's life. I'm going to find them a father, and it's good that they have a father. And she gets married again, thinking that she's making things better. But what actually happens, we have found in much research, the children go through another trauma, and their psychological difficulties increase again. And so they step down further from the natural design. And then you have unmarried step-parents, of course, and then you have the single father, single mother, which steps further. And then the final step down would be to have two mothers or two fathers. So why do we look at or think about same-sex parents in comparison to the natural family? It's because if you're going to move away from the natural family, this is the furthest away that one can move. So if my typology here that I'm pointing out, as you move from natural to unnatural, you create worse emotional, psychological difficulties for children, right? Because I've said that the natural family with those three aspects, now if I was teaching a class, I'd say, what are the three aspects, just to see if you remember, but I'm sure you remember them. The natural family's three aspects are for the benefit of children, so as we move away, we would expect to see more difficulties for children, and the greatest amount of difficulties would be with same-sex parents or same-sex relationships. Researchers from the U.S. Centers for Disease Control in 2010 did a study of the National Health Interview Survey, which is the largest public health survey in the world. It's been administered since 1957 in the United States. Surveys about 100,000 persons a year, if you can imagine. So they have this huge body of data as they aggregate year upon year. And they decided to look at family structure. And what they found is the nuclear family, which is their term for a mother and father raising their own biological children. I don't like the term nuclear family. It seems a little odd to me. Makes me think of bombs going off or something, but that's what it's called. So just think intact married biological parents. And they looked at the rate, the percentage of children who had a range of difficulties, emotional difficulties, other difficulties. Now this one is actually their physical health, but the trend is the same across all family forms. And that's the percentage who had these difficulties were lowest in the nuclear family and then rose as you went through other less natural family forms. So the blended family, that's post-divorce cohabitation. They're mixing children from two families, and then the cohabiting and the extended. And so it seems to follow the trend that I would predict from the previous slide that shows that ladder going down as they step away. The largest category they found was this one called Other. They just dumped everybody who didn't fit into these categories into this one. Who would most likely be in that other category? Once you've eliminated all of these family forms, who's likely to be there? Well, I'll leave you with that to think about, that the importance of the nuclear family is acknowledged widely today for opposite sex families. And here's one of the classic statements, that children are helped most in a family headed by two biological parents in a low conflict marriage. Children in every other kind of family form face higher risks of poor outcomes. But that same fact is widely denied when you're talking about same-sex parents. Here's the American Psychological Association says that the well-being of children are unrelated to parental sexual orientation. They've decided. The American Sociological Association, children raised by same-sex parents fare just as well as children raised by different-sex parents. These opinions were important for the Obergefell decision of 2015 that legalized, in a sense, same-sex marriage in the United States. As you know, same-sex marriage has been approved, is on the way to being approved in many countries of the world. This is the change in acceptance of homosexuality from 2013 to 2019 in different countries of the world. You can see that it was a high degree of change in the direction of support for homosexuality, mostly in the westernized, industrialized countries. The highest was South Africa, India, then Turkey, Japan, US, UK, other westernized countries. But it's not universal around the world. You can also see where support for homosexuality has declined. And it has declined, in fact, in this part of the world in a way. The highest decline was in the Czech Republic, but also in Russia, Germany. They don't have some of the other Eastern European countries on here, but they would be pretty much in this area of decline. So when you think, or someone says, oh, you're on the wrong side of history, everybody's moving toward acceptance of homosexuality or same-sex marriage, it's not true. What's happening is people are moving in two different directions, and that there are lots of folk in the world that are moving away from it, as along with those that are moving toward it. Here's this similar point, the number of countries that have legalized same-sex marriage as of 2021. By continent, you can see 17 countries in Europe, the highest, 9 in the Americas, 3 in the Pacific Islands, and then 1 country in Africa. Can we guess what country that is? I'll give you a hint. It's in the south of Africa. So there's a lot of resistance against this idea of same-sex marriage. Now, remember that chart from the bar chart I showed you from the CDC research showing increasing problems for children as you moved away from the natural family. Well, I took that exact same data and analyzed it separately. And what I did was, in addition to the opposite sex family forms that the CDC defined, I also defined children who are with same-sex parents. And you can see we have the same trend. Now, this is looking at emotional problems here. The emotional problems for children are the lowest if they're living with 2 married biological parents. Less than 5% of children in that setting have what are deemed to be clinically significant emotional problems. It rises with the blended family, with their cohabiting partners, single parents. And now we can tell who was mostly in that other category, because with same-sex couples, it almost doubles again from the next highest category. Emotional problems are far higher for children who are living with same-sex parents. So I analyzed this data a little more closely. I said, well, what exactly are the problems that are being put forth? So I looked at the Strength and Difficulties Questionnaire, the SDQ. It's the most widely used general measure psychological problems for children in the world. It's on all of the WHO, World Health Organization surveys. It's on most national health surveys. And it provides a highly validated indicator or predictor, if you'd like to use that word, of child emotional problems. And I found that just looking at all of the children with opposite-sex parents, which are these dark red bars, compared with all of the children with same-sex parents, that the children with same-sex parents are a little less than 3 times as likely to show, or they're 2.5 times as likely, we should say, to show clinical emotional problems than children with same-sex parents. So I wanted to look at some other measures to see if this was a consistent finding. This is called criterion validity. If you find something on one measure, you say, well, we would expect it to see reflected in other similar measures. So here's one that looks at developmental disabilities, whether the child has been diagnosed with ADHD, that's attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, which is a common anxiety-related disorder for children. Or if they have been assigned to having a learning disability or an intellectual disability. And that's almost twice as common for the children with same-sex parents. There's a question, has your child received medical treatment for an emotional problem, therapy, in the past year? Yes or no? And almost twice as many. Well, we'd have to say 1.7 times as many for the children with same-sex parents. The parents answered yes than with opposite-sex parents. Has your child been prescribed medication for an emotional problem in the past year? 3 times as many children with same-sex parents had been prescribed medication as had those with opposite-sex parents. So all of this gives us a picture that the children who are living with 2 parents of the same sex are much more susceptible to emotional or psychological problems than those who are not. Some of the problems that children experience don't really manifest until they're older, particularly the ones related to trauma. If a child gets severely traumatized, they may internalize that and ignore it, or we say stuff it down, and it doesn't come up until later in their life. And so I looked at another data set. This is the National Longitudinal Survey of Adolescent to Adult Health in the United States. It's one of the few gold standard longitudinal data sets in the world. It has lots of validation and measures to ensure that it's a accurate measure of the cohort that's being looked at. And so here at wave 1, which is when the children were about 15 years of age on average, I found on this data set some children who had been raised by same-sex parents. Not many of them. Notice there are only 20, right? So it's a small sample, but it's a very revealing sample. So here at wave 1, age 15, they say, are you depressed? Or actually, this was looking at the CESD, which is a common measure of depression. And we find that children with same-sex parents are no more depressed than the children with opposite-sex parents. There's no significant difference between them. But if you look at wave 4, so that's 13 years later, now the children are about 28 years old on average, you find that they are 3 times as likely to be depressed. So this is what I called late onset depression. And that was the main point of this study, but there were also suicide ideation was already high when they were younger, remained high when they were at age 28, and other measures. So again, it's a confirmation that same-sex parents really don't provide children what they need in order for their psychological flourishing. What surprised many when I published a study is that gay marriage made things worse for these children. And here is these serious emotional problems, which is another way of measuring the strength and difficulties questionnaire. And in this measure, you see that children who are living with opposite-sex married parents, just 4.6% are reporting emotional problems. We've already seen that before in another slide. If you compare them with opposite-sex cohabiting parents, it's a little worse with cohabiting parents. Well, we all know that. We expect that. If parents are married, children are going to do a little bit better than if their parents aren't married. But here you have same-sex cohabiting parents. The children are doing better if they're cohabiting than if they're married. The direction of the effect of marriage is reversed. Having opposite-sex parents get married, the children do better. Having same-sex parents who are married, the children do worse. Oops. Now, that was so surprising, I went back to the NHIS and tried to see if the same effect was true there, and it is. This is called an odds ratio. It's a measure of a comparison by percentages of the probabilities with two outcomes. And so here I'm comparing married opposite-sex parents with cohabiting opposite-sex parents. And this 1.56 tells us that the children are 1.56 times more likely to have emotional problems than compared to the reference group, which is married opposite-sex parents, okay? So it's very similar to finding 4.6 and comparing it with 7.0 in that first slide. But here, if we compare married same-sex parents, those are almost 5 times more likely to show emotional problems compared to married opposite-sex parents. And the cohabiting same-sex parents are only about 3 times more likely. So it's worse with married than with cohabiting same-sex parents. Well, you may imagine that the research establishment did not love and welcome this particular finding. In fact, they responded vociferously to denounce it, and we had other studies that came out. And so I challenged some of those other studies. And here is a chart. It's not my chart. It's from a very strongly pro-LGBT scholar who had to reanalyze his studies after I challenged it, and he came up with the same findings. In fact, so here, same-sex married is 4.16 compared to same-sex cohabiting, which is only 2.34. So the same finding, same-sex parents, it makes things a little bit worse than merely cohabiting. Same-sex married parents makes things a little worse than merely cohabiting same-sex parents. Well, this slide here updates the findings further, and I'm going to skip it because I can see your eyes starting to glaze over looking at all these charts. I don't want to bore you too much, you know. Imagine I'm making sex boring. I can do that, so let's not. We can update now. Those earlier findings were based on earlier data, only up through 2013. Well, what happened in the USA? We had the legalization nationwide of same-sex marriage in 2015. So I went back in 2020 and looked at the same survey and said, well, is there any difference now that we have lots more legitimately same-sex married persons on the file? This was part of a study that tried to show the benefits of the natural family. That was really the purpose of it. It's called the Case for Mom and Dad. And I look at all of the benefits compared to lack of benefits with having a mom and a dad, a two joint biological partners as one's parents. And that's the purpose of this chart. So the nuclear family, is the reference, and you can see, these are odds ratios again, all of them are high. They're all more than 1. This intact cohabiting tells us that children with intact cohabiting parents are 1.4 times more likely to have emotional problems compared to children with just married biological parents, and so on and so forth. But what you can see is if you go here, same-sex married, they're 5 times more likely, 5.4 times more likely to have emotional problems. Same-sex cohabiting, they're only 3 times more likely. So that was my outcome here with reference to same-sex parents. Now, I didn't really advertise this much in this study. It's been out now for almost 3 years. It hasn't been attacked. I don't think they've figured out that this says something about same-sex parents, because that's not the main point of the study, but here it is. Children do worse with same-sex married parents in emotional problems and in being retained in school. So this is the probability of a child being held back a grade or more in school. It doesn't seem to affect their physical health in these data. And they're both about equally likely to have attention deficit disorder, but there are these 2 findings. Someday, some LGBT researcher is going to find this, and then we're going to get a strong denunciation of this study, I think. But there it is, it's hidden. Do you know, you young people probably know what an Easter egg is, right? In a video game, right? It's a hidden fact there. Well, this is an Easter egg in my psychological study here. Why might children with same-sex parents suffer higher degrees of difficulty? Well, here are some reasons. The real answer is, I don't really know. I don't think anyone knows enough about these families to be able to tell you the full answer of that. I'm going to give you some theories I have. But one thing we know is that they're far more likely to have been sexually abused. Here's the National Longitudinal Survey of Adolescent to Adult Health data. This is for abbreviation, this is often called AD Health. And here in the AD Health data, 4% of children with with opposite sex married parents report that they were sexually abused as children, compared to 38% of children with same-sex parents. So that might have something to do with it. Parental instability. Here we have the percent of couples who are still together after 5 years. This is an examination of the census by a strongly pro-LGBT scholar, but what he found was 87% of opposite-sex couples were still together after 5 years, compared to only 44% of same-sex couples. So it's half as many. So there's a lot higher instability. We know that instability, family breakup, and trauma and transience is not good for children. So that might have something to do with it. Intimate partner violence, usually called IPV, is much higher in LGBTQ partnerships. A number of studies show that. So that might have something to do with it. The intergenerational transfer of sexual orientation. Now, this used to be widely denied by the pro-LGBT scholars because they didn't want to have people think that children who grow up with homosexual parents are more likely to be homosexual themselves. But the data was so overwhelmingly strong that today they admit that. But they say, well, what's wrong with becoming homosexual? That shouldn't be seen as a problem. But this is true. I'm going to go ahead to this slide just so you see this. The percent of adolescents who have considered same-sex sexual relationships, 17% with opposite-sex parents, a man and a woman, 64%, 2/3 roughly, of children with same-sex parents have considered becoming same-sex themselves. Well, that kind of makes sense. If both of your parents are persons of the same sex, we tend to pattern our own identities and budding relationships on our parents. So that makes a lot of sense. There's a special concern, I think, for girls raised by lesbian mothers. Imagine being an adolescent female, trying to learn how to like and relate to men, and you're being raised by two women, neither of whom like men or relate romantically to men. That's a real issue, I think. And so we do have a higher rate of homosexual uptake by girls who are raised by lesbian mothers than by boys who are raised by either lesbian or gay male parents. All right, I'm going to get back on track here. I might have just messed up the translators a bit, but they're smart. They can do this. Well, this is all on the same thing. So you can look at this and read the research about this. So what's the basic reason or cause for this higher difficulty? Well, the one thing I can point to that's pretty definitive is that children with same-sex parents, it's not what they have, it's not the parents they have that's the problem, it's the parents that they're prevented from having. Because every time you have a child who is placed with, in some way, two men or two women, one thing we know is that that child has been cut off from the care of one or more of their biological parents. Now, you might have to think through this a little bit, but you know, it takes a man and a woman to produce a child. If that child is subsequently being raised by two men or two women, then either their father or their mother is out of the picture. And so that deprivation, I think, is one of the key reasons that a child with same-sex parents has higher difficulties. Now, here I'm showing you from the NHIS the percent of children in all of these different family structures who are with both of their biological parents, or one biological parent, or no biological parents. And what I want you to see that's most important is that for children who are with both biological parents, almost all children in nuclear families, and most children in other kinds of opposite-sex families, have access to both biological parents. But the percent of children who have access to both biological parents in same-sex, with same-sex parents is literally zero. There are none. And so that drives, I think, this finding here, which is the strongest finding I can show you today. Children who are, this is this measure of emotional problems. Children who are living with both biological parents, just 4% report emotional problems. If they're living with just one biological parent and one step-parent or other non-biological parent, it more than doubles to 10%. If they're living with neither biological parent, they're being raised by another set of relatives, or they've been adopted by people they're unrelated to, or they're living with same-sex parents, neither of whom are, it doubles again. And so that's a hugely strong effect. Now, the only thing that could bring that about is the natural propensity for children to do better with their own biological mother and father. It's the only way you can explain that. People say, well, children need a man and a woman parent. They need complementary sexual parents. Well, I think they do, but what they really need is their own mother and father. So if you have no children in same-sex parents who are living with both biological parents, you're going to have worse emotional problems across the board. There are a lot of studies that have come out, people books that persons who have experienced growing up with same-sex parents or have struggled with same-sex attraction or homosexuality, and they report what it's like. And in most of these studies, if you look at them, they say, I missed the benefit of having a father. They sometimes say having a mother, but really having a father, because one of the little things they don't tell you about what we know about children with same-sex parents is that it's almost all children with lesbian parents. Well over 90% of studies that have been done of children with same-sex parents have really been done of children with lesbian parents. There are very few gay male parents in these these studies. So these children say, my lesbian mothers were not bad parents, and most lesbian mothers I've interacted with have pretty good parenting skills. It's not any thing to criticize the way that they raise their children, but the one thing they can't offer to their children is that one of them is a man. And both boys and girls need the influence of a man in order to grow and develop naturally. They also need the influence of a woman, but most children with same-sex parents, as I said, were lesbians. Now, so my theory is that man-woman parent marriage orients the desire of adults, which is generally a sexual desire, toward the possibility of children. Because opposite-sex couples generally conceive children. Doesn't mean they always, without exceptions, do, but they generally do. And they always may conceive children. And so marriage orients their desires, socializes it, you might say, to them. And in fact, most heterosexual sexual partners are raising children. 90% of them produce children at some point in their lives. Whereas same-sex marriage does the opposite. It orients the possibility of children to the desire of adults. Because same-sex couples never are able to conceive a child naturally, and very few of them actually do. Only a little more than a quarter of lesbian couples and 14% of gay male couples are raising children. So that form of so-called marriage is not oriented to the benefit of children like the natural set of relationships is. So it's not surprising, I think, that children don't fare as well. Gay marriage, I say, would be fake parents. We talk about fake news and fake science and so on and so forth. Well, every set of gay parents, as I've said, excludes necessarily one of the child's natural parents. And so gay so-called parents consist of two non-parents, or at most one natural parent and one non-parent. So gay parenting begins at the level of instability and rejection that natural parenting would come down to after some sort of trauma, a divorce or a death that brings about a change in the family. So parenting based on the exclusion of parents is a false promise. I don't think it should be called parenting. Just like I don't think that abortion should be called reproductive care. It's actually non-reproductive care. It's the opposite of reproductive care. Well, gay parents are really the opposite of parents. So we know that in international policy norms, children come first. A very strong assertion in the Convention on the Rights of the Child and those declarations. And so I don't think they envision that we would be arguing about same-sex parents or not, but they said that children shall not, except in exceptional circumstances, be separated from his mother. And there are similar statements with regard to the father. So we have an obligation, those with the authority have the obligation to preserve that family relationship. Now, those of you who are Catholic or religious, of a Christian religious bent, in the Christian faith, we know that the love of God is expressed in the Holy Spirit. And according to the main theory of that from St. Augustine, we have the Father and the Son who love one another, and out of that love, they generate the Holy Spirit, right? Now think about that. Here you have divine revelation telling us what God is like, and it uses the terms of the family, a father and a son. Couldn't God have thought of a better term if the family wasn't really essential or important? I would say, in fact, the family is sacred. It reflects the character of God. And one of the things it does is it generates a new life. Here's an elaboration of Augustine's theory that makes this more explicit, right? So you have two, I don't want to call God a being or an entity, but let's call him a being. Two beings loving one another, and so much that they are one, and that generates a new life. Is there anything familiar in that? Yes. So here you have the generative love of God is mirrored beautifully in human sexual love. You have the father and the son in their love. You have a man and a woman in their love. And that generates a new life. That's how new life comes into being, should come into being, through a deeply divine love. So same-sex parenting is directly contradictory to Catholic teaching. I just put this in here because a lot of Catholics don't understand this even. But here is from Cardinal Ratzinger, when he was head of the CDF, shortly before he was elected Pope Benedict XVI. He says, the absence of sexual complementarity in same-sex unions creates obstacles in the normal development of children who would be placed in the care of such persons. They would be deprived of the experience of either fatherhood or motherhood in an environment that is not conducive to their full human development. He is 100% right in that. And my research affirms that. I'm sure that he didn't sit down and do statistical research himself, but he was smart enough to see the principles in it. Pope Francis has confirmed this. There's no argument there with regard to different popes. Here's from Amoris Laetitia, the latest statement on love in the family. Every child has a right to receive love from a mother and a father. Talking about natural rights, that's the right of that child. If you want to go back to Donum Vitae, it says that the child has the right to be conceived, carried in the womb, brought into the world within a conjugal heterosexual marriage. It's through this relationship that the child can grow. So again, a fundamental right to be the fruit of the specific act of the conjugal love of his parents. You can't get clearer than that, I think. So the child has the right to the care, not just of heterosexual persons, but of his own joint biological parents. These last slides are for people who are interested in the foolishness of the alternative research. I'm going to skip that in the interest of time. If anybody's interested, you can ask a question about that. Thank you very much for your attention today. It's been a great pleasure and joy to be with you. Are we taking questions? After. Okay. Questions?
If I can, one short remark. Could you send, please, your slides to the organizers in order to share?
I would be happy to. Thank you.
Na, išties šito pranešimo skaidrės tikrai reikėtų parodyti mūsų parlamentarams, kurie labai svajoja apie partnerysčių įteisinimą Lietuvoje. Ačiū dar kartą.